Hey everyone, welcome to the Kill It Off Screen podcast. My name is Joe, and I'm joined by my friend, co-host, and horror historian, Prentice.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast with the best horror news and reviews. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're not talking about a movie. We're going to talk about one of Joe's Letterboxd lists of horror essentials, basically the most influential horror movies of all time, according to Joe, at least. And before that, we have a lot of news to talk about because someone decided to go on vacation for a couple weeks. So it's been 3 or 4 weeks since we last recorded, and a lot of shit happened.
Yeah, you're going to cover that. I was in vacation mode, so I was not really tracking any news throughout that time.
I'm gonna be super for real. I mainly have the more recent stuff, but there's some stuff that I think obviously we're gonna have to talk about, just kind of generally. So first bit of news: Abigail came out. I haven't seen it. I do plan to watch it because it looks really fun. I know I talked about it a little while ago. Um, Following up on that, Late Night with the Devil is now on streaming. It's on Shudder. So anyone who's looking for the chance to watch that, especially if you want to watch it before our next podcast, which is spoilers, we're going to be doing a full in-depth review of Late Night with the Devil. I would recommend giving it a watch. And let's see, has anything else come out in the last couple weeks? We already talked about the first Omen, right? We've talked about Immaculate.
No, I don't think I talked
about
about either of those. I watched them. I thought they were both good. Of course, very similar to one another. Brief tangent on that. I was seeing some reviews kind of shitting on the first Omen just because it's very similar in terms of plot and setting, etc., to Immaculate, and so people are viewing it as almost like a ripoff or something, or kind of like, like the redheaded stepchild of it, even though they're different properties, and it's not really fair just because a different similar movie just kind of happened to be made at the same time. But no, I thought both were good. I definitely seem to like Immaculate more than most people. Thought Sydney Sweeney was very good in it. Thought the direction was solid. I was kind of surprised by that one. And the first Omen I was even more surprised by because, typically any kind of prequel or late sequel or remake to any kind of long-standing horror title or franchise is most often a cheap cash grab when they don't care. But there was clearly a lot of effort. Again, the direction in that one was also very solid. Good performances. I had more issues with the script in that one, but yeah, both were good. Immaculate's like an 8 for me, and First Omen's like a 7. They're both good movies.
Yeah, I don't think anyone expected the first Omen to be good. For basically every reason that you said. So impressive as well. I will say, I think there were some people who were also a little skeptical on Abigail, but that has released to an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes critic review, which is
Yeah, I was seeing it was getting some good reviews out of the
number
gate.
than I expected. Yeah, usually I don't know what its other ratings are. That's just the one that popped up on my news feed. But that's really good for a horror property, especially one that's got a child, I guess, protagonist. I don't know if that's the right word. I haven't seen the movie yet. But a child front and center, like child actor front and center, and not based on anything as far as I could tell. Maybe based on like a short story or something, but no, not like a sequel or a prequel or a established property. Like, that's pretty impressive. I'm planning to try and give it a look whenever I can.
Yeah, I've made it clear that I don't personally put much stock into Rotten Tomatoes unless it's overwhelmingly negative. Like, I can't think of any movie on Rotten Tomatoes that has less than, say, a 30% or 25% that I truly think is genuinely amazing. Where I'm like, no, these 400 critics all have it wrong. That movie's great. Like, when it comes to the really, really low ratings, I'll put stock into that. But to me, I don't really care much if something has a 55% or a 75 or a 95 or whatever. I mean, Climax and Suspiria 2018 have 60s or something on Rotten Tomatoes. So Yeah, I don't put too much stock in it personally, but I know on Letterboxd, I think it has like a 3.4, 3.5 or something, which is definitely not bad.
Yeah, pretty good.
It's just that radio silence thing. People are saying the movie's just a lot of fun, very gory, just that
Oh yeah, I've
classic horror comedy
heard some good
vibe
things
that
about
radio
the
silence
practical
loves.
effects.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so it seems like Ready or Not 2.0 basically in terms of the tone and the vibe and everything.
Yeah. Speaking of Ready or Not, Radio Silence are making a sequel to Ready or Not, and they did like a press junket or a press release or something. They came out and they said, "Oh, let me find the exact quote because it is pretty interesting." They said it's going to be an absolute banger of a sequel. So I'm like, they used the words "absolute banger," which they're on my. Yeah, here's the exact quote. They said they're still getting it figured out. It's still getting figured out. What we can say is that there is a script that is an absolute fucking banger of a sequel, and however it gets made and in whatever capacity we are helping get it made, we're so excited that it's happening. So, I liked Ready or Not. I thought the ending was one of the most fun. I don't know if it's a twist, but like kind of surprise endings in horror movies
Right.
for a while. Loads of fun. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I won't spoil it because the ending is fucking. It's a blast. Um, I'm excited for a sequel to this, as long as it's not just like we're bringing oh, what's her name,
Samara Weaving?
Samara Weaving back. Yeah, so it looks like she is coming back to star. As long as it's not just like, hey, play another game, Samara Weaving. I'm I'm cool with it. I think it'll be fun and really interesting. If it's just like, hey, we're bringing Samara Weaving back and she's just a new cursed family that wants her to play a game, then I'm gonna be kind of bored.
Yeah, I don't understand how you could. I mean, what kind of luck would you have to meet two different people in two different families that have like the same upbringing and also have like a murderous game on wedding night or proposal night or whatever? That'd be, you'd have to be cosmically unlucky. Like, just God hates you if that ever happens to you. So, yeah, I'm not sure
God,
what
or
the
whatever
angle
the
would
fucking
be, but I doubt it's
demon
that.
in that is. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but yeah, I don't really have any news this week. I don't know if you want to
I've
keep
got
going.
a ton more. I have been keeping track.
By all means.
So Terrifier 3, Damien Leone's new Christmas slasher sequel, has wrapped filming. So that's exciting. I don't. It's gonna come to theaters just later this year. They haven't given a release date. I wouldn't be shocked if it's a winter Christmas like holiday release because it is a Christmas themed horror movie.
Right.
I'll say I'm excited for this to an extent, but I don't love the Terrifier movies. So, I mean, that's going to be controversial, I think. I think people kind of love these
Nah.
movies, but
Those
I don't think I think they're fun enough, but they kind of get like overkill to me and not in like a fun way.
definitely. Yeah. I know for the second one, and this was definitely more of a marketing thing, like in one of the servers that I'm in for horror, people were like kind of freaking out about it. For the premiere, they were doing a thing where they were passing out branded barf bags and like, yeah, there's that one kill in like the bedroom of that one
Yeah.
poor girl where like it's very over the top, just like the hacksaw kill in the first one, where they're definitely just trying to one up it each time. So now I'm trying to see what they're going to do in the third movie. It's probably gonna be like a 20-minute long scene of
Oh
or
no.
killing someone because you got to keep escalating it, I suppose. But yeah, I don't love them. I thought Terrifier 2 was definitely a huge step up in pretty much every department. I like the kind of synthwave soundtrack. The direction was better. They actually could afford, extras at different locations and everything. Um, I thought it was just too fucking long. That was my problem with it. Like the third act in that haunted house setting, you can tell they were proud of it because it just keeps going on. Like I was begging for the shit to end. I'm like, why is a basic killer clown slasher movie almost 2.5 fucking hours long? It's way too long. Doesn't need to be.
Yeah. I don't know. It was just a bit too much for me, and not in the like, this is not in the like Bone Tomahawk way of like, I don't really want to be watching this. Like, I don't want to be looking at what's happening on screen, but in more of the like, this is taking too long and you're really drawing it out, and you seem to like, you're enjoying it in a way that you shouldn't be. Like, it's okay for horror movies to enjoy cruelty to an extent, if that's kind of the point of the movie, but like it just leaned too heavy into that. And for me, it was like, I don't know if, to me, as someone watching this, if you're still enjoying watching this, like maybe there's some brain chemistry that needs to be addressed for you. And that's definitely gonna be controversial. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. For me, I don't know. Neither of them have been incredible to me, but I am still excited for this in a kind of morbid way.
Yeah, I don't completely agree with that take. I mean, to me, the Terrifier movies, the violence is like so over the top to where it's not like really disturbing in a realistic and grounded way. Like I know the first one, like that hacksaw kill, the first time I watched it made me like genuinely like sick. Like it really
Mm-hmm.
made me queasy. And after that, like I haven't really felt anything like that. Again, the big kill in the second one did not get any kind of real reaction out of me at all. And I think it's just because I was like mentally prepared this time and I kind of knew what I was going to be getting into, unlike the first time putting on the first movie on Netflix when that was out. But yeah, I don't know if I really agree with that take. And yeah, I think it, for especially people who like those movies, will definitely be kind of controversial. But yeah, they're not grounded enough to be really disturbing to me, but they are very over the top and gratuitous and kind of mean spirited, I'll say. Like it definitely gets to a point where I definitely don't think it's fun anymore.
That's kind of what I mean. And I will say I unironically enjoy Jason X. So watch whatever movies you watch and like whatever movies you like. I'm not gonna judge you. But also like there is a level of enjoying watching other people suffer that maybe you should have some introspection on. Anyway, on to the next piece of news. This is a movie that I've just learned about that I'm actually kind of excited about. Because I like the lead actor in this. But Joe Manganiello is going to star in a adaptation of Keith Blackmore's book series Mountain Man, which will have him battling zombies. It's a post-apocalyptic survivor situation. The main character in it struggles with alcohol abuse, suicidal tendencies, till he finds another survivor. Like it's very boy meets girl zombie movie, but it's just bleak and like violent and kind of dark, and I kind of love it. So I'm really excited about this. It's gonna be directed by John Lee, whose name sounds familiar, but I don't recognize any of his movies. And it's gonna have a script by Matt Deller, whose name also sounds familiar, and I don't recognize any of his movies.
Yeah, I don't recognize any of their names or prior works either. Nothing really sticks out or comes to mind. But
Yeah.
yeah, zombie work and very bleak. Sounds pretty good to me. You had me at bleak.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking forward to that. And second to last piece of news, because the next one is, I think, the one that we're going to talk about the most, and I've kind of bundled them. Trailer came out for a new M. Night Shyamalan movie, Trap. I don't know if you've seen this trailer yet.
Think I have now that you're mentioning it. I did see something about a new M. Night movie, and I always get like so mad because dude made like a couple good movies early in his career with The Sixth Sense, and I think it was Unbreakable.
Unbreakable. I think The Village
Signs
is really
as well.
good. Signs. I think Signs is really good.
Signs is definitely good. Like he was good early on, and like I know Split was pretty popular. I didn't care for it, but that one was
Glass
pretty
was
well
really
received.
stupid.
Yeah,
The
Glass
Happening
is very
one of the
bad.
worst movies on the planet.
Exactly, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like he's got
Avatar:
like a
The Last
couple
Airbender.
hits,
Whew,
and
one of the worst movies on the planet.
like he somehow still just has the ability to get like anything that he wants made, and it always is like high profile. Like for some reason his name still is up there with star power and generating, getting people to go to the movies and see it, like a Spielberg or Tarantino or something, even though he like it's just not been good for the most part in his career. And like it just infuriates me so much, like seeing guys like I'm gonna bring him up again because I'm a fanboy, I know, but like seeing people like Zoller, like S. Greg Zoller, who have like great ideas and can't get funding for shit, and M Night can just keep pumping out garbage just anytime he wants. Like it makes me genuinely angry sometimes when I think about it.
I will say some of his more recent movies have been solid to good. I think the exception in his recent run of movies is Glass, which I think isn't terrible, but the ending is not, like, the ending kind of ruins the movie, and to a lesser extent it also kind of ruins Unbreakable. But I think this actually looks interesting. So it's got Josh Hartnett starring in it, who I think is good in pretty much everything I've seen him in.
Yeah, I
He's
like him a
not
lot.
he's not winning any Oscars, but I don't think I've ever not enjoyed a Josh Hartnett performance. So like that's a win on its own. He he is playing a father of a teen daughter, and they attend a pop concert, and it looks like the pop concert venue gets completely surrounded and locked in by the police or the government, and they're searching for a serial killer. And this is in the trailer. If you don't want any spoilers for this, it's in the trailer. I don't think this is going to be the big twist, but in the trailer it turns out that Josh Hartnett probably is that serial killer that they're looking for. And I say probably because it's M. Night Shyamalan. He could have the whole movie have him be the serial killer, and then right at the end be like, actually the pop star was the serial killer, and that's the twist. And Josh Hartnett just has people locked up in his basement for a completely different reason. But like, apparently it's going to be a theatric, like an event movie. Like he said, it's going to be, you're going to get the full experience of going to a concert. I've seen someone say that the movie is rumored to be almost 3 hours long, which is
Fuck that.
yeah, too long. M. Night, if you're watching this, get in that editing booth, man. 220 at most. But I am interested in this, and it's one of those movies where if there isn't a twist, I'll be completely fine. Like, I'll be happy if this movie doesn't have a twist, because I think it has. I think the premise itself is interesting, and I would rather just see how it plays out. But if there is a twist, I'm interested in whatever the fuck that twist is going to be too. So I don't know. Like I think of all of the M. Night movies I've seen in a while, outside of The Watchers, which I think is out and I haven't heard anything about, so it could be bad. I don't think I've been interested in an M. Night movie as much as this one in quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't know. From what you're describing, it just sounds like such a gimmick. The whole like we're gonna simulate it in a way to where somehow watching this movie feels like you're at a concert, and the runtime. Like I don't understand people boasting about a runtime, but at any rate, yeah, it seems like kind of a gimmick and a cheap way to try to get people interested. When I feel like if the movie itself is good on its own, you shouldn't need to do that kind of thing. And then on top of that, I feel like if you're M. Night with your reputation and what everybody knows about your movies, especially at this point in your career, the best twist that you could probably do is just not having a twist at all. That's probably the best way to subvert expectation, I think, at this point.
Agreed. I will say the last bit of news I have on this is Hartnett did an interview recently where he described the movie as, quote, very bizarre and very dark. So, very dark is interesting. Like that as a description of an M. Night Shyamalan movie. Has he done a dark move? I guess Split's probably the closest.
Maybe. Or The Sixth
know.
Sense, but I don't know.
Sixth Sense. I don't know if Sixth Sense is dark as much as it's sad.
Somber? Yeah, like more
Yeah.
melancholy.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I'm excited for that. And last piece of news: Blumhouse, boo, and Lionsgate, whatever, are joining forces for a brand new Blair Witch Project movie. And on top of that, the original stars of Blair Witch, I think the original 5, so the 2 directors and the 3 actors, released a statement asking Lionsgate for retroactive residuals on the movie, recognition from Lionsgate for, I guess, their role in creating the movie, and meaningful consultation on any future reboot, sequel, prequel, toy, game, ride, escape room, etc. As in any of them which would or could reasonably assume that Heather, Michael, and Josh's names and or likenesses will be associated for promotional purposes. So I think that's really fair.
Yeah.
Just off the top, like that is their names and faces as much as it's the names and faces of like movie characters, and I think it's incredibly fair for them to say we want to say and to be able to consult on anything you're doing that would use our names, faces, likenesses, or the names, faces, likenesses of the characters. Up front, I think that's super fair. I don't think they're going to get retroactive residuals just because Lionsgate is a big movie company and generally they tend to be bastards about that stuff. I do think they have a pretty good case for future residuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lionsgate were behind the 2015 Blair Witch movie, right? Or 2016?
I believe
Either way,
so, yes.
if that's the case, then it actually bodes pretty well for all of them because I know Ray Hance, formerly Heather Donahue, was. I brought it up in our Blair Witch episode, but, you know, she was saying that they were actually very respectful and very considerate when talking to her and going about everything with that movie. So maybe if it's the same people and same group, then I could see them being very open to their wants and demands. But yeah, I guess we'll see. Like, I agree. I don't think it's unfair, especially if they're being used, like their likeness in the movie. Then yeah, residual sounds very fair.
Oh, and they did actually, I just pulled up the letter so I could read their statement. They asked for one more thing, which I think is so fucking cool. They asked for the Blair Witch Grant to be created, which is a $60,000 grant paid out once a year by Lionsgate to an unknown or aspiring genre filmmaker to assist in making their first feature film.
That's
So
cool.
that
Paying it forward.
rules. Yeah, and it's a grant. It's not a development fund. So Lionsgate would not own any of the rights to the project, which is also rad. Like, if that happens, even if that's the only thing that comes out of this, that's a cool fucking thing for them to ask for and to make happen, honestly.
Yeah, that sounds like people who, of course, got big off of, you know, a very small indie movie and are remembering their roots and now trying to help somebody else try to accomplish the same thing and get that same kind of opportunity and recognition. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm really happy to hear that. I think that speaks volumes about their character across the board.
Yeah. And that said, with all of that out of the way, Blumhouse shouldn't be making this movie.
Yeah, just keep them out of everything. Just
This is gonna be bad if Blumhouse is making the Blair Witch reboot.
yeah, I mean, if it's both of them collaborating, them and Lionsgate, then hopefully Lionsgate are the ones kind of pulling the strings and making all the decisions, which, again, they're the ones who I believe owned the property, judging by the 2016
Yeah,
movie
Lionsgate
by
owned
Adam
it.
Wingard. Then yeah, I would assume and at least hope that they're the ones with more of the creative liberty and just more authority over what we end up seeing as the finished product. Because if it's Blumhouse, I'm very scared.
Yeah, it sounds like Blumhouse is going to be making the movie, and Lionsgate is going to own rights and distribution, which is, that's not what I would prefer.
Yeah.
I don't know. If this is the same Blumhouse team, because it does sound like Jason Blum himself is going to be involved. So if this is the same Blumhouse team that made like Insidious or Sinister, even like the team that made Megan, that would be rad. It
Not
can't
Megan.
be,
Get that out of there.
I mean, that would at least be something new. Like Megan, I don't think Megan's amazing. I think it's fine. But at least they
It
did
sucks
creative
ass.
stuff with the filmmaking. They did a lot of good practical stuff. It can't be the team I would want if Blumhouse was fully in charge of this would be the team that made Get Out or the team that made Black Klansman, which are both Jason Blum movies that were, or they weren't Jason Blum movies, they were Blumhouse productions that were really excellent. But you're not going to get Spike Lee to make a Blair Witch movie. you're not going to get Spike Lee's team to make a Blair Witch movie, and the whole team behind Get Out became Jordan Peele's production company, so that's not going to happen either.
Yeah, it's really going to depend on who they announce as like the writer and the director of it. I mean, if they get like James Wan, Lee Winnell, Jordan Peele, like those people who, have made the better horror movies under the Blumhouse umbrella, then yeah, sure. But outside of that, boo, boo,
Yeah.
Blumhouse.
Yeah, I don't know. I would love for this to be good, and if it's not going to be good, I'd love for it to be interesting. But my current thoughts are it's not going to be either of those things.
Yeah, I will maybe check it out probably. But you good to go ahead
Yeah.
and get into our main
Yes.
topic for this one?
Let's get into our
Okay,
main
perfect.
topic.
All right, so as we mentioned both earlier this episode and then the last one, this is a list of about 40 something movies that I view as being essential viewings. Like if you're a horror fan, at some point you should check these out just at some time where you have the time and you have the availability to look at it. And so the criteria, I'm basically reading off what I actually have typed on the page itself. I'm going to post in the description the link to the actual Letterboxd list. If you want to play a fun game, you can maybe pause and then, after I read the criteria, feel free to pause and see how many you get, like what comes to mind, and see if it's on here or not. But basically, these are movies that are not just good. A lot of these, of course, are. Some necessarily aren't. And I'm not even a fan of all of these, but they are movies that either were their first of something, so like the first slasher movie, the first zombie movie, etc. Movies that kind of changed the game in some way with some type of new innovation. Movies that inspired a bunch of copycats, imitators, and kind of began a bit of a trend or era. Movies that have lasting cultural significance or a prominent place in pop culture, which I feel is the most subjective of these. And then, of course, movies that are a really good representation of the era that they were made in and that really stand out from an era. And like I said, it's not always necessarily the best movies, but just ones that are very significant. So I know I gave you this list, and I asked you, the only real prep work I asked for you to go through and just kind of jot down ones that were either kind of a question mark, maybe you didn't get it, or ones that you maybe just don't agree with at all, just off of seeing it at a glance. And I think the best way to do this is we'll go chronologically, and then when one of those pops up, you can raise that red flag, and then, we can kind of talk about it. But I think it's the best way to not start jumping all around, and we can kind of flow through this kind of nicely. Also, we don't know how long this will take. This might be a half-hour kind of deal. This might be a 2.5-hour kind of deal. Hopefully not the latter, but
I will say as well, and this is probably something that could wait till the end, unless you want me to try and figure out where they would fall chronologically, which I can do as we go, but I'll be paying less attention. I have a list of movies I think should be on this list.
okay. Yeah, I think that'd be good to do at the end, and then we can kind of
Yeah, so I think we
discuss
save
those.
that for the end. I think most of my thoughts are in agreement for most of these. I do have a couple where I'm like, well, it could be different. And then a couple, there's only like 3 or 4 where I'm like, you don't need that movie to be on this list.
No, I'm excited to hear those, and I'm excited to do this episode because it's going to be it's probably going to be the most informative thing that we've done on here. We're going to take a deep dive to at least a certain degree, and I'm excited to go through a lot of the history of horror and the different eras and the trends. And so the first one on here, like the timeline, we have from 1896 all the way to 2017. So we have 42 movies within that time frame. And are you good to just go ahead and jump into the first one?
Yeah, I am. Do you want me to introduce them?
Sure.
All right. So our first one is comes in at a whopping 3 minutes long.
Yeah.
It is La Manoir du Diable, or The Haunted Castle, directed by I think it's Jorge Méliès, but it could be Georges.
I think it's Georges Méliès. I think it's just
Is
like
it
Georges.
Georges?
I mean, I'm not
French.
sure. I don't fucking speak French.
I don't think
but
French people say George. I think they say Georges.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, oh,
Maybe
okay.
not saying it
I
well, but
heard
that's
you
what I'm
say
trying to
George.
say anyway.
It's either Jorge or Georges Méliès, who is a French filmmaker, and this is just like it's one of the first. It might be the first,
It
technically,
is.
horror movie. Um, it's just a guy walking around like a church slash castle, getting scared by skeletons and ghosts for 3 minutes. Um, Iconic, really, but not a lot happens in it.
Yeah, it's and I think it's what I've heard is Georges Millier is how I've heard the
Georges Méliès?
pronunciation. But if that name sounds familiar to any of you listening, it's because he is most famous for A Trip to the Moon, which is a, of course, very famous early movie from 1902. But he made like a billion things, most of them which are very short, a lot of kind of in-camera tricks and sort of fun things like that. And you can check out the Haunted Castle. It's also sometimes called like House of the Devil. It's got a billion different names, but you can watch this for free on YouTube, and I recommend you do it. Like Prentice said, it's only 3 minutes. Pause, check it out, and you can say that you've watched literally the first horror film ever made. And so, I think that alone justifies putting it on here. It's like the very first horror media on film, pretty much ever made.
Yeah, I agree with it being on the list just because it is literally the first horror movie ever made. It genuinely, I don't think you can get more influential than being the very first one. So basically by default. Actually, I think there's one other horror movie on this list that might be as influential, and
That's fair.
it's within the first 10. So we'll see how that works out. But we do got number 2. I believe chronologically number 2 is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is
Yeah.
a classic of the genre, a banger, if you will.
Yeah, I want to mention this one and Nosferatu. That's the third one, and I want to mention those because they're both in that like German, very expressionist early 1920s silent horror era, which was again one of the very first types of eras of horror to ever exist. And again, they're both noted classics, both very iconic movies. You have other ones from this time, like Haxan. Don't know if I'm saying that right. That was also from 22, I believe, but it's not quite as well known or seemingly as important as Nosferatu and Dr. Caligari. I mean, those are,
Yeah.
again, from the silent era, probably like the two biggest and most influential and memorable movies. And same thing, like some of these there's not much of a conversation, like especially when we get to like some of the 70s and 80s where like we get a lot of our big classics, like it's just going to be like title of movie, end of conversation.
Yeah.
And I think those two I think those two are kind of in that same boat.
Yeah, for sure. I think they both hold up still. I will say I think Nosferatu holds up better than The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and I think you probably have the opposite opinion.
No, I would agree with that.
No? Oh, okay, cool. I thought for some reason I had a memory of you saying Caligari was one of your all-time favorites.
No, it's not that high up there for me.
Okay. They're both really good though. If you've got, I think they're both under an hour and a half. They're both like 80 minutes ish. And they're good. They're fun. If you haven't watched a silent film, they're entertaining. Stuff happens in them, which I think is one of the biggest complaints to some silent film movies. Is a lot of people are like, it's just people doing things, and then text appears on screen, and nothing happens. Like stuff happens in Nosferatu and Caligari, so definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, and like Prentice said, they're not very long because around this time, full length was usually not like 90 minutes. It was like 60 to 80 around there. And typically, when you watch these, like when people watched these back in the day, they had music playing. They weren't just sitting in a completely silent room. I've gotten to watch Nosferatu with a live score, and it was a lot of fun. It was a really great time. And so, just if you're gonna watch these and you find them on YouTube, like find one that has a score. Don't be El Stupido and just find one that's just completely silent, because no matter how big of a fan you are, no matter how much of like a movie lover you are, it's hard to just sit in complete silence and just watching, pictures moving without any kind of audio whatsoever. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and
that's
then
1 through 3 so far. Sorry, go
once
ahead.
you watch Nosferatu, find the Willem Dafoe movie about the making of Nosferatu and watch that because it's entertaining as hell. I'm trying to find what the name of it is. I can't remember offhand.
Wait, was
Um,
that about the making of Nosferatu or Nosferatu the Vampire from '79?
it's no, it's about the making of the original Nosferatu, and Willem Dafoe
Okay.
plays Max Schreck, who's actually a vampire. It's called Shadow of the Vampire. It's got John Malkovich, who plays F.W. Murnau, who was the director, and Willem Dafoe, who plays Max Schreck, who is actually just a vampire like Nosferatu. And it's a banger. That movie rules. Uh, so watch Nosferatu and then go watch that movie and have just a blast.
Yeah, but I think we're going to get into our fourth one. We have Frankenstein by James Whale, 1931. This is where we get into a lot of our universal monsters. Like that's like the first in the West, like in the US, that's like the first real era of horror is like the universal monsters starting, in like the early 30s. You get Frankenstein, you get Dracula, the Invisible Man, you get Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You get like all these things. And Frankenstein, I would imagine you said the first 10 on here. I would imagine either Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein is the one that you're referring to
They're
with like
not.
most
I think
influential.
they're
Dracula
both.
then maybe?
It is Dracula. Yes, the
Okay.
next one on the list. I think Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein are both incredibly influential though for
Yeah.
horror movies as a whole, and also just like cinema as a whole. I think both of them extend past that. Only topped by Dracula. I think. Which is the next one on the list. And I mean, needless to say, I agree with Frankenstein. Go watch Frankenstein; it's really fun. He kills a child, so be ready for that.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't in the release for a very long time. They really cut this movie down, and and originally when it was released, it didn't have it had that scene where he's sitting with little Maria by the water, but it's just that, and then it cuts. And so, of course, that gives people a very different impression of what happened when they don't see the full scene of the monster tossing her into the lake or into the river, not intentionally to harm her because they're just throwing flowers in there and he doesn't understand. And, he thinks that she's going to float too, like the flowers. But yeah, so it carried a very different connotation for a long time until they finally released it. I think it was like decades later with that full scene. And then there's also a theory about Frankenstein because James Whale, the director who made many of these, including The Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein, was openly gay, which was a big thing for, obviously talking about the early 1900s. And so like the persecution of the monster, a lot of people kind of theorize or speculate that that's like a theme relating to, of course, the treatment and persecution of homosexual people. It's very debated. You can pick whatever side you want on that. But I just thought that was interesting to bring up.
Yeah. And then next, of course, is Dracula from 1931, starring the one and only Bela Lugosi as the titular Count Dracula. This, I think, is perhaps the most influential horror movie. I mean, there's a case that can be made for like 10 movies on this list and probably 3 or 4 that aren't. But for me, I think this is the most influential horror movie. Influential to cinema as a whole as well. I honestly, and just like, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna say this. This is a weirdly sexy movie. And not in like the way that you'd think of like slasher movies from the 80s where it's just a bunch of topless women, but everyone in this movie clearly wants to fuck everyone else. and you see it on screen.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know, just fun fact, that there's a Spanish Dracula movie from the same year. They were actually filmed at the same time. So like all the same sets that were used by Todd Browning and his crew for the American Dracula. I can't remember if it was like Spanish or like specifically Mexican, but either way, there was a Spanish language Dracula, and it was like I think at night the American crew would work, and then like in the day they would swap, and then basically they had the Spanish language one, or it's the opposite. Either way, they were filming both at the exact same time, and like no one really knows about the Spanish language one. I didn't until like last year when I just saw it pop up on Draft House. It was pretty incredible to learn that. But yeah, Frankenstein and Dracula, incredibly influential movies. There's not really much debate that they are essential at some point. They're two no brainers as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I think genuinely, if you had to cut this list down to 5 movies, Frankenstein and Dracula are in that list still. So, and they're good. They're good movies.
Yeah,
There are
they hold
some
up.
movies. There are some movies on this list that I don't think hold up, but are influential. Frankenstein and Dracula and Nosferatu hold the fuck up. Like, there are some good movies. But yeah, we'll move on to the next one, which is Freaks from 1932. I want you to defend this choice.
Sure, it's one that admittedly is kind of on the fringe for me. Like if I go through it and I'm like, okay, I have to remove one of these, it's one that's kind of a contender. It's not as big. This is also by Todd Browning. It was very controversial. A big one why it's on here is because this was arguably the first horror movie that like really pushed the boundary in terms of violence and disturbing, shocking content. Not only just because of where American society was in terms of how we viewed people who were differently abled. And so having, actual quote freaks in the movie, people with actual deformities and just all of those issues. Like, of course, none of those were like effects. Those are just actual performers and like circus performers that were in the movie, which just shocked many, many people. There is a full half hour that is cut from this movie, and it's just gone. I believe it was lost in one of like the MGM vault fires. And of course, this movie came out almost 100 years ago. Like anybody alive, like has not seen this entire movie. So like that, and obviously 30 minutes is a lot. Like it's even a lot if like 5 to 10 minutes are cut from a movie, but a whole half hour is a substantial amount even today. And that's of course just lost forever, and it makes me very sad whenever I think about it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the first big reason. And then I do think it's a movie that does have some kind of lasting cultural impact. Like, for example, small example, the man, they went by his actual name in this, Schlitzie. His appearance is very memorable. It's referenced quite a bit in some different horror media. For example, American Horror Story Season 2, Asylum. Pepper, I believe was the character, was made like intentionally to resemble Schlitzie. So some things that are very memorable from the movie in that way, like one of us, like is from Freaks. And so I think it has like enough kind of lingering impact is combined with its push for more disturbing content. Like the ending was really cut down.
The original ending
this
is
movie.
very disturbing.
Exactly, it's brutal. Like they like castrate
yeah.
the strong man and like turn him into like a castrato singer.
Yeah,
like
they make him sing falsetto, and then they tar and feather the. I think it's the love interest. Is it the love interest of the circus leader guy? Yeah, they tar and feather her, and they make her into the human duck, which is super dark, honestly, and like very interesting. You're right that it's a very interesting progression of horror super early on. I don't think this is. If I was making this list, I don't think Freaks would be on it. I don't think it'd even be borderline. I think the most lasting thing about this movie is the one of us, and that also comes from like a bunch of other things. And I don't think just that one line on its own is really enough for me to put it on the list. But I can understand the rationale behind it.
Yeah, and I completely respect that. It's one that I might even take off in the future. Like I put the same note on the Letterboxd list. Like it's a constant work in progress. Like it's,
For sure.
I don't think this is one that's ever going to be completely done. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's the first one where it's very, very debatable. Like I said, it's really on the fringes for being on here. It might go off in the future, but do you want to go on to number 7?
Yes, let's go on to number 7, which is The Invisible Man. Absolute banger. I love this movie. This does not need to be justified to me, not just because I love it, but also because this is a super influential horror movie. Like, not only because everyone knows the Invisible, like even people who don't watch horror movies, if you're like, it's the Invisible Man, they're like, oh yeah, the guy who wears the bandages and he's invisible. And then if you ask them like, yeah, and he kills like 700 people, they're like, what? So, this movie rules, and everyone should watch it. And this guy has one of the highest kill counts in horror.
Yeah, it's when people look at villain kill counts in horror movies and they see Jason and like Michael and everybody, they're surprised to see the Invisible Man really, really high up there. And it's really just because of one scene where he crashes a train and it's like 100 people in the train. It's like what they say in the movie. So that really pads his body count. I think
the actual math of it is like he has like 450 kills by the end of the movie, but the on screen,
not
like
the end of that movie.
What they actually talk about is only like 200 people die. So
no,
I don't know how.
I've seen this movie like 100 times, and I'm fairly certain it's not anywhere near that amount. Like he kills a decent bit. There's like a search party of like 15 or 20 people that he kills. A couple, like the one cop that he bashes with like a bar stool or whatever, and there's like a few more. Kemp that he kills. I love that scene too of him pushing his car off the cliff, and then they do give an official number of like 100 in the train crash that he causes, but it's not anywhere near like 200 or 400. Either way, it's a little off topic. It's still like a really high body count.
He kills 122 people confirmed in the first movie.
Boom.
And that's just, yeah, he derails a train, and then a bunch of people go and search for him, and he kills them all.
Yeah, and I have to say, even though it's mostly a voice performance, I adore Claude Rains in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he just absolutely crushes it. The supporting cast, like Henry Travers and Gloria Stewart, they're great as well.
Incredible practical effects Whale. That are
yes,
so
that still hold up
time.
really well. Oh yeah. I watched the featurette about how they recorded the scenes of him kind of becoming invisible, like when he's taking off the bandages and when he's like removing like his clothing and everything. And it was like they dressed him in like a velvet suit and then kind of filmed him against like a velvet backdrop, and then
so he wouldn't
created the.
Yeah,
exactly. So it was kind of like almost early green, like the predecessor to like green screen, basically, in 1933, which again is very impressive. It holds up really, really well. And I do want to say not all the Universal monsters are on here, just the ones that really resonate. Like, for example, The Mummy. I don't think anywhere near as many people have watched The Mummy.
I think genuinely the 90s Mummy movie has more cultural impact than the original The Mummy movie.
Yeah.
Which is
I would
crazy.
agree with that. It's kind of why it's not on here. Like,
yeah,
they're not all on here. It's just the ones that seem to really have like lasting.
There is one coming up that
Dracula,
I don't agree with. That I think same reasons The Mummy should not be on here. But we'll get to that. First, we have to do The Bride of Frankenstein, which is
one of the greatest sequels of all time.
Banger. Super good movie. No question from me. This should be on this list.
Yeah, same with the original Frankenstein. Even just like the extremely memorable makeup and costume design, especially for the bride. Like I've said, like in terms of kind of like an aesthetic, it is like my favorite design ever. It's like my Letterboxd profile picture. Like I love the bride in this movie. And I own like a few different things that have her on it. I hated learning that apparently when they filmed this, the actual hair color is like orange with like the white streak. And so with all of these, I always just like seeing it like in grayscale. I never enjoy seeing things where people put it into color or like do remasters or anything. I always just like viewing it in black and white. It feels very off to me in a bad way whenever I see it in color. That was just a little side note, but yeah, it's an incredible sequel. It's a great movie. People very much misremember, probably because they haven't actually watched it, that like the bride and the monster are not in love and the bride fucking hated him. She's not in the movie that long either. It's kind of just a little bit at the very end.
Yes, the movie is a Frankenstein sequel that just happens to have the bride at the end, um, which I don't hate. Like I love this movie,
Yeah.
and I
And
think
then,
yeah. Oh,
sorry, did you want to finish?
no, I was just gonna move on to the next one.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, same. Next, we have The Wolfman for 1941. Again, another memorable Universal monster movie. I'm so ready to move past the Universal monsters. Like it's The Wolfman.
Yes,
Like
it's the Wolfman. Everyone like this is another one of those ones where it's like the Wolfman, and people are like, yeah, he's a werewolf,
yeah,
and you're like, well, sure, we don't have to get into it.
like close enough.
Yeah, it's a great movie. Really fun. I think of all of the Universal monster movies that are on this list that I think should be on this list, The Wolfman is the one that's the most like, this is just fun.
For sure.
So, and that's important in horror. You just have some movies that are just fun to watch. Like they don't have any grand, they're not like super intense. There's no grand messages. They're not based on any like operatic novels. They're just fun. And The Wolfman is that. And I think it definitely deserves the spot on the list. The
Yeah,
next
and
four
sorry, I wanted to
movies.
say side note.
Oh.
You also do have Claude Rains and Bela Lugosi in that, and then of course Lon Chaney Jr. kills it in the lead role.
Yes, everyone in that movie in this movie kills it. Just really well, just really good. But as for the next one, I think I said the next four. At least 3 out of the next 4 you're really gonna have to justify for me. So we have Cat People next from 1942. So why is this on this list?
The big reason is that this movie has what's kind of widely regarded and agreed upon as the first jump scare in all of horror. And it's a really good scene where the protagonist, I cannot really recall, it's been a while since I've watched this movie. I can't recall like the names of the characters, but she is kind of being stalked by Simone Simon, her character who turns kind of at times into like a panther. And it's a really great suspenseful scene where she's walking and being followed, or at least she believes she's being followed, and it's walking under just like the constant, circular, just like the, street lights, like cutting back and forth as she's looking behind her, and then it's drawing your attention behind, and then immediately there's like a honk of like a bus in front of her that she kind of walks up toward. And so it's a jump scare, and it's, I believe the idea came from producer Val Lewton, and so it's referred to as the Lewton bus, and that's kind of agreed as the first jump scare in horror. So that's kind of the main reason. This is admittedly one like Freaks, where like I kind of look at it and I'm like, maybe I could take that off, but it's that, and then I wanted another one from the 40s. I wanted representation from like all the decades. I didn't just want The Wolfman because that was a Universal monster movie. And so I wanted to take a different kind of suspenseful movie from the 40s that kind of captured where horror was. Because really, we'll get to it with Psycho here in a little bit. There's not many left, but Psycho really laid the groundwork for modern horror. Yeah, like before
sure.
1960 with Psycho, horror wasn't anything like what we have now. Like again, like you have the Universal monsters, and like that's kind of the closest thing, really. But that's still a far cry. And so I wanted to throw this in there just as like another bit of representation for what horror was pre-Psycho in the 40s.
I think you know what? I think that's fair. You're gonna have to some of the ones coming up. You're really gonna have to justify.
Sure.
But I think that's fair. I think first jump scare is important. I think you're. I think it's okay to push to have an extra one from the 40s. I will say, it's kind of telling that they weren't really making a lot of movies in the 40s because there was something else kind of overshadowing the early 40s. People weren't really like, not a lot of filmmakers were like, ooh, I've got plenty of time and people around to make a movie. No, they were fighting in World War II. But
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I can agree with that. I'm pretty sure I've seen still images of the lady as a like panther lady. So Yeah, I can agree with that. Can you justify the next one, which is Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is the the Universal movie that I don't think has had any cultural significance? They don't. We can't even make a remake of this movie. Like, what's on the list?
Well, this one as well as the next one, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, are mainly on there because you get into the 50s, and the 50s is really defined by just kind of weird sci-fi. When you watch them, again, they don't feel like a horror movie. It's just kind of bizarre sci-fi. A lot of people speculate that it's linked to the Cold War and kind of a fear of like the advancements of science and technology. And so that kind of gives birth to sci-fi. So you have The Fly, you have The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You just have all of these movies, and that's what really you could say like horror was. There's also the movie Them, which is a really fun one, the giant ants movie. And so Creature from the Black Lagoon is still like a memorable Universal one and one of the more well-known movies as well as creature designs. And so I just wanted to grab at least a couple from that decade. And Invasion of the Body Snatchers is also like maybe the most popular one, and also one regarded as like one that's actually a really good movie. Not many of those are regarded as actually being good, but Invasion of the Body Snatchers is, and so that's kind of the simple explanation. It's like 50s representation of the sci-fi.
I think I can agree with you on Body Snatchers. I don't think I can agree with you on Creature from the Black Lagoon. Um, I will say I think you're right that it's representative of the 1950s. I just don't think it's had the impact long term. I think the two things that it has going for it are it's probably the most famous horror movie from the 50s and cool creature design. And neither of those to me warrant it being on a list of the most impactful horror movies of all time. Um, but like it's just kind of a goofy movie. Go watch it, I guess. Yeah, I don't think it's a bad movie necessarily. It is goofy as hell.
It definitely is. I mean, a lot of them from that era were extremely goofy, to say
I
the
will
least.
say, in regards to Body Snatchers, I do think the first Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a good movie. I, if I were to make this list, I would have put the remake, which I think is not only a better movie, but one of the better horror movies kind of ever.
Yeah, I know you love that one. And the remake is
So,
definitely better.
yeah.
But again, if we're talking pure influence, like, and also the 50s one represents its era better than, the remake does for like the late 70s. Like
Yeah,
the 56
that's fair.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a way better encapsulation of its time period it came out. So that's kind of the reason why that one's on there, but the remake isn't. Like if we included everything just because it was really good, we'd have like 20,000 movies on here.
And then next up, we have the 1958 Dracula with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. I don't need two Dracula movies to be on this list. If I'm making this list, there's not two Dracula movies on it. Technically, there's three because Nosferatu is just a unlicensed adaptation of Dracula. So I don't need the 50s Dracula on here. I know you were probably trying to get another 50s movie in there, and Christopher Lee is a fucking baller in this movie, and also he killed a lot of Nazis in real life. So hell yeah.
Oh yeah,
But
that dude did like everying that you
yeah,
could do
he
in
was a
life.
spy, killed a bunch of Nazis, won an Oscar, I
Our metal
think.
vocalist. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just fucking hell yeah, Christopher Lee. But this movie's not. I don't think this needs to be on the list.
So I will say it's actually not the reason I included it. Do you want to take any other guess as to why?
Is it the first horror movie to technically win an Oscar?
No. So I added this because it's the most notable from Hammer horror. So Hammer films, which just became known as like Hammer horror. So that's like a subgenre all of its own. They are not incredibly popular, but it is still a very big collection of horror movies, many of which come from previously established titles. So a lot of them are Dracula movies, Frankenstein, The Mummy, etc. Many of which directed by Terrence Fisher, just like this one, and many of which featured Christopher Lee, usually as Dracula. Fun fact, when he did The Wicker Man, he actually did that movie for free because he was like so tired of being typecast in these Hammer pictures that he just wanted to get away from it and really, flex his acting chops doing something different. And it's good that he did because he kills it in that role, just like pretty much everything he did in his entire career. But
there's not a bad
it's one you could
performance.
debate. For real.
I think,
so that's why I put it on here, because I wanted to give representation to Hammer horror. And again, this is like the biggest, best one that of course features both him and Peter Cushing.
Yeah, I think that's mostly fair. I guess just for me it feels very repetitive, and I don't think it actually had the same way the original one was the most influential movie on horror for me. I do not think that this movie was very influential on horror going forward, especially considering the movie that's right after it on the list.
I can agree.
So for me, that's why it feels like it's kind of overkill and doesn't meet enough of the criteria to be on the list. But let's move on to the next one, which I think this is another one where you can just say the name and go, yeah, and move on, which is Psycho 1960. Yeah.
Yeah, Psycho lays the groundwork for modern horror. It basically kind of invented, the POV shot from the perspective of the killer that became absolutely instrumental in horror ever since, again, especially in slasher movies. There's not a whole lot that needs to be said about it. You said Dracula is the most influential. If I had to pick one, it would be Psycho, because it really is a situation for horror where it's like, when you look at horror, like I mentioned earlier, there's horror before Psycho and horror after Psycho. It really is that big. So if I had to pick one, it would probably be that, but that's just me.
You're right. Of course. I think there's an argument for 3 movies on this list to be the most influential, and Psycho and Dracula are 1 and 2 in whatever order you put them in.
I can see that.
So that's just for me. I do think you're right that it is probably Psycho. I really wasn't thinking about Psycho as we were going through chronologically. But you're probably right that Psycho overall is the most influential. But yeah, we don't need to keep talking about Psycho. It's Psycho. You're going to have to justify this next one.
Sure, yeah. This one
really
is definitely fun. So the next
this...
one is... do you want to announce it?
So, all right, gang, listeners. Who here has seen the movie 2000 Maniacs? No one. Yeah. All right. Justify this.
All right. So this is another one, kind of like Dracula 1958, where it's like it's really just there for representation. Like when I made this, part of the goal was to try to capture at least one thing from almost every kind of era and like different kind of genre and subgenre, but it's kind of a fool's errand when you think about it, because there's so much. Like you're probably never going to be able to really do that entirely, but I made my best effort. And so after Psycho, there was a man named Herschel Gordon Lewis who basically saw Psycho and really wanted to do that, but make it way more violent and way more bloody. So that gave birth in the early 60s to a subgenre called splatter. And it was the precursor to torture porn and gore. I think, to my knowledge, the first like really gory horror movie was the Japanese one Jigoku from 60 or 61 or like 59, somewhere around there. But I didn't include that one. I didn't feel like it was like really big enough. But 2000 Maniacs is by Herschel Gordon Lewis, and it's not his first one. The first one was called Blood Feast, which I believe came out in 1963. And he has a lot of them, like Color Me Blood Red and The Wizard of Gore and a lot of other ones like that. But I think a lot of people kind of agree that this is the best version of it. Like, where after he made Blood Feast, everyone's like, yeah, this really sucks. And then he made 2000 Maniacs, which none of his movies are particularly great. But this is the one that's probably the best version of what he was going for with a splatter movie. So that's really the only reason why it's really there, is like to get some representation of the kind of splatter subgenre and era of Herschel Gordon Lewis, because he's still a big name in the genre when you really start diving into it.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of makes sense now.
to an extent. I still don't think. I think this movie. I think I get the idea behind what you're saying, that he as a director and the genre that he developed and horror as a genre was developed by him continuing to make these movies. I don't think any one movie he made was influential enough. And I especially don't think it's 2000 Maniacs. If we're being super honest. Like, I think he deserves to be on a like list of influential horror directors who moved the genre forward. I absolutely would not put any of his lists on a list of the most influential horror movies.
Well, keep in mind, I just had to pick one.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, I definitely agree with what you're saying, that like he, as a filmmaker, was more influential than any one of his works. But
I don't
it's
know
one
if
where I
you-
just picked one of his works to throw onto there as
Yeah.
the inclusion.
I don't
agree
know
with
if
what
you
you're saying.
did. I don't know if you did have to pick one. I think it's really okay for a director to be super influential and not have a movie itself that's super influential. Like, not everyone is Romero and Hitchcock. But there are a lot of directors who aren't Romero and Hitchcock who have developed the genre. So, like, I don't know. I don't think he needs a shout out on the best movies list. I think he does deserve a spot on influential directors list, and that's just kind of, I can separate those two things personally, and would.
Well, keep in mind, this isn't best movies.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I just don't think any one of his movies belongs on this list. I think he belongs on his own list of directors. But let's move on to
I
the
can
next
see
one.
that.
Because the next one is another one where we're just going to say the name and go, yeah, and move on. Because it's Night of the Living Dead. And we've talked about this movie a ton. So, yeah.
One of your favorites.
Yeah, all-time
Yeah,
banger.
the first zombie movie of all time, George A. Romero's directorial debut. Not much more needs to be said about that one. It's Night of the Living frickin' Dead. So do you want to go ahead and get on the next one?
Yeah, and the next one I agree with, but I think is maybe potentially a little controversial, which is Last House
I'm
on the
surprised.
Left.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that you. I was expecting to like start defending myself on this one again. Yeah. So the reason why this is on here, not really for this reason, but one, it's the debut of Wes Craven, and two, this one as well as Texas Chainsaw, which we'll talk about in a second. This is the real first time ever where horror starts to get way more violent. There begins to be more of a fear in people about violence. And this is kind of where like more fixation with like serial killers and just like more violent crime kind of starts erupting. And so directors started making movies to kind of exploit that fear. It's like early, like I said, it's exploitation. So Last House is a very good representation of that all on its own. It is a very controversial movie. I know when it came out, people were like boycotting it and trying to get it pulled from theaters. There was one in particular, and this is on the Wikipedia, and I really agree with them. And again, it might be a controversial stance, it is, but I agree with them when they said that Last House is actually a morally upstanding movie, and it is about the, horrors of violence, and it is not at all glorifying it in any way. And I definitely agree with that 100%. It's still not fun to watch. It is very disturbing, and it's very hard to look at, but I agree that it's one of those movies that we've kind of mentioned where, like you mentioned with Terrifier, where it's like making a movie that's very violent and very gritty, but doing so with a purpose and actually having a theme and impact in mind. It's not like mindless shock value like some people think it is.
Yes. I definitely agree with that. I think in terms of, I think for me, this is much more than like 2000 Maniacs and even a movie like Freaks. I think this is the jump forward for horror in terms of maybe not acceptable content, but like starting to push the boundaries of content a lot more, especially in regards to violence and and this is going to be this is a trend I think later, but I think it does sort of start with Last House, of the exploitation of women.
Yeah.
And I think for those reasons deserves to be on the list. Wes Craven, obviously on his own, would be on the director's list as well. And I do think Last House is really, really influential in that regard. Is Last House the one with the just remember it's only a movie?
Yes, and
Yeah.
that still like that trailer and like the voice and everything. That still like freaks me out to this day. Like that's one where kind of like the opening ending of Dawn of the Dead '04. If I'm like in a dark room or whatever, it's like 1 a.m. and I put that on. Like that puts me in like a creepy mood. Like it
Yeah.
still kind of gets to me. And fun fact, that actually wasn't the first movie to do that. The first one was actually by Herschel Gordon Lewis, and it was Color Me Blood Red that I mentioned earlier. It did the
Ooh.
same, it's just a movie thing in its trailer. Obviously, not anywhere near
Not
as
as
well
famous, yeah.
and not as memorably as Last House did. But yeah, I liked that you mentioned that, and I got to throw that out there. But yeah, great trailer. It's a very good movie too. I don't love the whole like bumbling cop side plot. I think that was thrown in to try to add like some levity and comedic relief.
Yes. They were like, if we don't
But
put something fun in this movie, someone's gonna overdose in the crowd watching this.
yeah,
But yeah, it's a great movie. And in literally on a complete 180 for the next one, uh, which I agree should be on this list. I should put that out there first. Is The Exorcist. I don't like this movie. I don't think this movie holds up. I do think it's incredibly influential, and that's about the end of my thoughts about it. To be honest, about this list.
yeah, it's one kind of like Night of the Living Dead or Psycho. I mean, The Exorcist is The Exorcist. You don't really have to justify it in a list of most influential essential horror movies, as well as the next one that we'll talk about. But with The Exorcist, it was a big one that kind of helped to legitimize horror. It's always had a bad rap. If you're seeing how most people don't really like horror or like critically it doesn't do well, that's not brand new. Horror has always been that way, and it likely will always be that way. And The Exorcist was a big title to, um, like I said, it legitimized it, and it also just kind of was a movie of, oh hey, you can make a horror movie that has very like ridiculous, out there, shocking things but also make like just a very good, well crafted, critically acclaimed and crowd pleasing movie. And also, people might be surprised to hear that this movie did not offend or shock religious audiences because in the movie, of course, the Catholic priests are very much the good guys. They are objectively the heroes, and they do successfully save the day. So,
Whereas in the real world,
yeah, so that's a good thing to point out as well. Unlike Rosemary's Baby, that was like I think ruled like a cardinal sin or something if you watched or like possessed that movie by the church. The Exorcist did not upset the religious crowd,
yeah.
and
And
yeah,
then
and that covers it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
and the next one, which again I think for some of these, like, if there really isn't a ton to say, because the next one's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which you love this movie more than I do, but
It's top three.
undeniably incredibly influential for horror.
Yeah, it's another one just like The Exorcist where you don't have to really justify it. I do want to say because I want to give at least some thoughts on these if I can. This movie gets a very bad rap. It's because of the name, and again just because of the name and like some of the memorable scenes. It gets a really bad reputation for being way more gory than it really is. If you actually sit down and you watch this movie, when there is violence, it's actually shot pretty tastefully. Everything is kind of just off screen. It's not like a bloodbath kind of movie. It's not a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie. It's actually pretty artistic. Like it's kind of an art film in a way. It's all about the tone. It takes a really long while to really get into the more violent bits later on in the movie, and they're extremely well done. The acting is phenomenal from really everyone. And yeah, it's a great movie. And it's one where I've said before, like, you don't have to have watched every movie or a specific movie to be a horror fan. Or, again, like you can dislike Psycho, and you can still be a horror fan. Like, it's okay. But this is one where if I talk to somebody who's been a fan for a long time, and I'm kind of like, oh, like you haven't seen Texas Chainsaw? Like, it kind of, you know what I mean? It surprises me in a way. So yeah, it's easily an essential.
Yeah, for sure. And the next one is Black Christmas. I also agree with this one being on the list. This is essentially the first slasher movie.
Yes.
Really developed the. I mean, I don't know if it developed. It started the slasher genre, really. I think movies like Halloween and Friday, which are coming up, developed the slasher genre a lot more. I don't have a ton to say about this, though. I don't know if it's necessarily like a stellar movie.
It's very
mostly,
good.
yeah, it mostly holds up, but it's not like I wouldn't give this an 8 or a 9 out of 10. The way I would give some of these movies on this list. It really is just the movie that created the slasher genre. And that alone is enough to be on this list, to be honest. But like that's kind of what it's famous for.
Yeah, but this is one where I'm glad you brought up like what you would rate it or how good it really is. This is definitely not one where like maybe it doesn't hold up or it's kind of bad, but just because it was the first. Like, no, this movie's like actually really
Yeah.
good. Like, there's really solid filmmaking in this. There's lots of really like haunting imagery, like what's kind of on the cover. I always am like haunted by the image of like the one woman in the rocking chair in the attic with the plastic bag around her head, just like rocking back and forth by the window. Like, that's awesome imagery. It's really memorable. Again, all the POV shots in it, everything with Billy the Killer. Yeah, Black Christmas fucking kicks ass. Definitely go watch it if you haven't. It's a really fun early slasher, and it did directly influence John Carpenter and Deborah Hill with Halloween, which we'll get to. But the next one may be a confusing one for you.
I don't disagree with this next one. And I know why you chose it. And I feel like I should just let you talk about this, but I'll introduce it because that'll be the most I talk about it. It is Deep Red from 1975 by Dario Argento. And I agree that it should be on this list. Is it the first Giallo movie?
No, I believe The Girl Who Knew Too Much by Mario Bava was the first
Yes.
Giallo
I think you're
movie.
right.
But
I think you're right.
there's a lot that you could pick. I went with this one just because it's really, really big. And it's a little more subjective for me, maybe just because I like this movie a lot and I like Argento more than I like other Giallo directors. But yeah, you could go with a lot for this. This is another representation one. This movie itself is not super big in terms of, its impact or anything. It's just like, if you're making an essentials list, you got to have some inclusion for Giallo. And I actually didn't think that at first. And this is another reason why this list will never be done. There will always have to be edits because with movies like *Malignant* and *Last Night in Soho* from the earlier 2020s, Giallo really became more popular. Like those references to Giallo in those movies really brought it more into the limelight. Not for everybody, but for horror fans in particular. And so that's when I actually went back and added a Giallo movie, realizing I didn't have one. Is because I was like, okay, Giallo's a lot bigger now, so I gotta get some inclusion in there.
I will say it's not a Giallo. I don't think necessarily. I am shocked Suspiria is not on this list.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about Suspiria many times. Maybe it should, but it's one where Suspiria is so self-contained, and I can't think of
It hasn't
like
changed
influence.
horror. Yeah,
Exactly. And
It's
so
just a
it's
good
not, and it
movie.
doesn't represent exactly. Suspiria is just a great movie. That's like a top 10 for me. I love it. But it's one where, it doesn't represent Giallo like Deep Red does. That movie much more fits the kind of conventions and the tropes of what a Giallo movie really is. If I wanted to recommend just one for a person who's never seen one to really get it, it would be Deep Red over Suspiria. But you could put anything. You could put Blood and Black Lace. You could put A Bay of Blood, Tenebrae, maybe Torso by Sergio Martino. But I just went with Deep Red. But they're interchangeable. You could just throw a lot on there.
yeah. And I think I've got a lot to say about the next one.
Oh yeah,
Which I see you fittingly rated 5 stars. I'd be real mad at you if you hadn't. Which is 1975's Jaws. Which I don't think this is the third one on the list when I said there were 3, but by God, it's got to be close. Because this really invented the idea of blockbuster horror. of horror as
Definitely.
popcorn movies, of horror as a movie that you go to as an event in the theater. And also, it's really good. If you haven't seen Jaws, it's rated PG, I think. Like, you can watch this movie with, I don't know if I'd say children. You can watch this movie with, like, 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds. And just, they'll be afraid of sharks forever. And that's fine. But yeah, this movie fucking slams. And it truly was, I think, as much as Psycho was a turning point for horror as a genre, Jaws was a turning point for horror audiences. And yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say other than this movie fucking slams, and it changed how people think of horror and how they approach horror as a medium or a spectacle to go and observe.
Yeah, I'm gonna augment what you were saying about the blockbuster. Like, this movie really did invent the blockbuster, not just for horror, but like
sure.
this movie made so much money, and this is the one that really impacted studios in terms of seeing how much you can truly make off of filmmaking. And so, like, because keep in mind, this was pre Star Wars too. Like, Jaws came out before Star Wars,
Oh yeah.
and made a shitload of money. So that's what really invented the summer blockbuster. First and foremost was Jaws. So not even just for horror, but just for movies as a whole. And then lastly, I want to say there are people who say this movie isn't horror because like it's PG, which like so is fucking Poltergeist. So what? And then also because there's a little more of like that Spielberg lighthearted tone. It's not quite as, dread-inducing as a lot of other ones. But like Jaws is a fucking horror movie, guys.
Oh, for sure.
It's
Anyone
horror.
who watches I can't remember the name of the character. I should. Anyone who watches the monologue about the USS, fuck, I can't remember the name of the boat either. Anyone who watches if you've seen Jaws, it's the monologue. If anyone who's watched the monologue about the boat sinking in Jaws and the sharks beginning to swarm and doesn't get chills and kind of get a little uncomfortable in their seat and really like fucking feel the impact of everything going on in the movie and the characters on screen, and then says that this movie's not a horror movie, can fuck off.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah, no, just a banger movie. And we're going to move right on to another banger movie that also was a bit of a genre definer, Dawn of the Dead from 1978.
Yeah, really augmented the concept of zombies and more defined what they are as we know them now.
Yeah.
Like Night of the Living Dead, you don't see them as much like really eating people and everything. And
Yeah.
like Night of the Living Dead, they're like, God.
Night of the Living Dead made zombies. Dawn of the Dead made modern zombies. And really, like, we wouldn't have movies like, I don't want to spoil more coming up on the list. We wouldn't really have horror movies the way that we do now without Dawn of the Dead. The same way we wouldn't have zombie movies at all without Night of the Living Dead. So, like, George Romero Romero deserves a lot of credit for inventing and then reinventing zombies.
Yeah. And doing so with a very different tone as well.
Yeah.
Like Dawn is a very different tone from Night of the Living Dead, and it's very impressive. And again, it's also just one with like huge cultural impact. It's one that gets referenced all the time. Like I always think of like that South Park episode where it's like the homeless people episode, and it's like Dawn of the Dead. It's like the kind of like running away from some group like to the mall. Like it's a big thing that a lot of different shows or movies have done some kind of like parody of. It's very well known, and it's very recognizable even to people who don't really love horror. And I think that's really, it kind of closes my thoughts on the movie. You don't have to justify it very much.
No, I think maybe this whole row, if you're looking at the list, starting with Deep Red and ending with the one at the end of the row, just doesn't really need to be justified.
Yeah.
Because the next one's Halloween. Also from 1978. First of all, can we just say 1978, banger year for two different subgenres of horror really being defined forever, with Dawn of the Dead and then Halloween, which is essentially the template for the modern slasher. That's right? There's no, like, Black Christmas invented slashers as a subgenre. Halloween defined slashers probably forever.
Yes. So the difference is that Black Christmas did it first, but Halloween is the movie that really blew up. Like Black Christmas was not a super popular movie like
Probably
Halloween
because it's
was. Again, like
Canadian, right?
Halloween, yes, it was a Canadian movie, which
Those
maybe
damn Canadians.
plays, and maybe that plays a role, and maybe it just wasn't as popular in the U.S. because it wasn't made in the U.S. But at any rate, Halloween really, really grabbed people in a way that Black Christmas didn't. And a lot of that was Black Christmas having kind of like an anonymous killer, while Halloween, of course, had the instantly iconic, visage of Michael Myers. And this is one that I think nowadays is like more popular knowledge. It's not as like much of like a hidden fun fact anymore, but Halloween originally was supposed to be like an anthology type of series. So if you're wondering, like if you've ever seen all the Halloween movies like in a row and you wonder why Season of the Witch is just like this random one that has nothing to do with any of the other ones, that's because Halloween was going to be like its own thing. And it was going to be an anthology where like every different movie would be centered around the holiday of Halloween, but a different story each time. So Halloween was so big and so successful that they were kind of obligated to make a second one. And that was kind of like their, okay, like we did a second one, we gave you another one, like we gave you more of what you wanted. Now we're going to get on to what we wanted to do. And they made Season of the Witch, and it didn't have Michael Myers, so everybody hated it. And I'm happy that now people really love Season of the Witch. It's not uncommon for me, like in online spaces, to see people say that they like Season of the Witch more than the original Halloween. That is not like a super hot take anymore for people. I definitely don't think it's better, but I mean, I understand liking it. It's a really good movie. But yeah, it's Halloween.
Yeah, there's really not much more to say. And then coming up next is Alien from 1979. Can we we should all stop for a second and appreciate the 5-year run from 1975 to 1980. Just the whole of horror as a genre and most of its subgenres pretty much got defined by that 5-year stretch of movies going from Jaws to Friday. Incredible. But Alien
there's
right
a couple others that we
smack
gotta
in
talk
the
about.
middle. Yeah. Alien right smack in the middle, 1979, the sci-fi horror movie. I think probably one of the first creature features, along with Jaws. In at least in terms of like modern horror creature features. Just a banger movie. Go watch it. Like, there's not much more to say. It's really good. Go watch it. It did define kind of sci-fi horror and space horror as we know it, and kind of creature features as we know them.
Also, the tagline itself was, like with Michael Myers, instantly iconic. The, in space, no one can hear you scream. That was just the tagline itself really grabbed people. And
sure.
like you mentioned, it kind of invented sci-fi horror. Like we mentioned sci-fi in the 50s. If you watch Alien and you watch any of those movies, you see a very clear difference in the tone and the atmosphere that they're setting up. Like 50s is just kind of science fiction. Alien is sci-fi horror. Like there is, if you watch them back to back, you will see a very clear and stark contrast in why they're different. So yeah, Alien definitely brought that in. The xenomorph is still one of the most recognizable creatures and designs in really anything, really. And just like some of the other ones, like this is the era that I was talking about that I alluded to, saying like, we're not going to have to justify a lot of these. Like these are like the classic era where it's like, yep, Halloween, easy one. Alien, easy one. Jaws, easy one. So you got to go ahead and get to the next one?
Yeah. So the next one, I think this is where of all of the ones in this stretch of movies, I think this next one could be replaced with a couple other movies.
I can see it.
And I'll recommend them in a second. Like when we get to the end, I've got a couple I'd recommend and some changes I'd recommend. But it's the Amityville Horror from 1979. I don't think this movie's great, but I'm guessing it's on here because it's kind of the haunted house genre, like subgenre, is what it developed. And to an extent, also, it further developed the kind of religious horror subgenre of like, there's a demon, we got to get rid of it.
Yeah, you pretty much hit it on the head. I don't think this movie is amazing either. We have Poltergeist on here, a few more slots away. We're definitely on the back half now. Or I don't know the official count that we're on, but we're far into the back half. We're approaching the last dozen or so. But yeah, I think Poltergeist is a better movie. But Amityville, of course, came first. They're both on here, by the way. We'll get to Poltergeist, but yeah, Amityville came first, and again, it's very recognizable. One that is still pretty prevalent. It's one where even if you just have like an image of like that wall of like the outer wall of the house with like the windows and you just show it to somebody like, oh yeah, Amityville, like anybody's gonna recognize it instantly.
Yeah, no, I agree. And next up is movie that fucking got absolutely dunked on when it first came out for no reason, but is an all-time banger, The Shining from 1980. And this is what I mean when I say 1975 through 1980 just had banger after banger after banger. Some of them aren't on this list as well. But yeah,
The
but,
Omen,
I mean,
Suspiria, Carrie, Body Snatchers.
you've named two in that list that I would recommend putting on here. But yeah, I don't, what's there to say about The Shining? It's one of the greatest horror movies of all time.
Yeah, some would say number one, and I can very much understand that argument. You would have a case for it.
Yeah. I don't know more to say about it than that. It deserves to be on this list.
Yeah. It's another one where it fits like every box of like, representation of the era, cultural significance, etc. Like it kind of ticks every box. And it's also one where if you think of movies that are like parodied and referenced and whatnot, like The Shining is also one of the highest up there.
Yeah. One of the most referenced movies of all time. And then we'll move on to another, maybe one of the most referenced series of all time, not maybe the most referenced movie, but the next one's Friday the 13th, also from 1980. And again, when I tell you 1975 through 1980 was the most influential 5 years in horror, this is what I'm talking about, because it caps it off with Friday the 13th, the movie that, as much as Halloween did it, Friday the 13th is probably actually responsible for modern slashers, as well as a lot of modern, like post 80s horror is inspired by Friday the 13th.
Definitely. And what I think a lot of people kind of get wrong or misremember is that Halloween really popularized the slasher, but like the real slasher boom didn't really start until Friday the 13th came out. Because it was one where Halloween was really big, and there were still slashers made, ones that aren't very memorable, things like Don't Look in the Basement or like Silent Scream and things like that a lot of people don't even know exist. But Friday was the one that showed people that you could basically rip off Halloween. Like an admitted clone of Halloween. Like I think I've said it before, even on this show, where Sean S. Cunningham called up either a producer or like Victor Miller, the writer, somebody he wanted to work on the movie with, and pitched it, where he literally said, like, word for word, hey, Halloween's making a lot of money, let's rip it off. And then other people saw how successful you could be and how much money you could make doing that. And then, of course, that's what really blew up the slasher genre going into the 80s, and why the 80s were so defined largely by slasher movies. Obviously, you have a lot else. There was so much horror in the 80s, but slashers did rule the landscape for quite a long time, and we'll get more into that later on with some of the other movies. But Friday was the one that really blew the starting whistle in that regard.
Yeah, no, for sure. And up next, we mentioned earlier, we do have Poltergeist, another one of the haunted house movies. Really important in not only popularizing haunted house movies, but also kind of defining what they would be forever. It's also, I think, the reason that the PG-13 rating was created, which on its own is a big kind of societal influence.
Yeah, this movie's PG. I don't think a lot of people remember that. There's also a lot of debate as to how much of this movie was actually made by Toby Hooper and how much was done by Steven Spielberg because he was involved as well, even though Hooper got official directorial credit. Because a lot of people do say that like it largely was Hooper who made the movie, but it does have kind of that Spielberg tone, like Jaws does. Like it's definitely more gruesome in a lot of ways. Like for example, the scene of the guy going in the bathroom and like peeling his face off and everything. Like it's a little more, I think sometimes maybe not necessarily violent, but like the kind of set pieces more fit what people think of when they envision a horror movie in Poltergeist. But it still kind of maintains a little bit of that lighthearted tone where it's not overbearing and full of a lot of dread, just like Jaws. And so it does make me wonder like how much was Hooper and how much was Spielberg. But yeah, like this to me kind of is like the haunting movie. Like when I just think of like a good influential haunted house movie, Poltergeist is maybe number one to me.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And next up, genuinely of all of the movies on this list, this is the one where we can just kind of go, yep, and move on. It's The Thing 1982. And yeah.
Yeah, it's a movie that does everything. Another one that was hated when it came out, and people speculate that it was maybe because of E.T. Like, these are both, alien movies, obviously very different movies in literally every way, but I think people were like upset because you had a very like heartwarming and family friendly alien movie with E.T. and then you had The Thing, and it's like a gross out movie in a lot of ways, and people just didn't connect with it. And I'm really happy that it's gotten the recognition it deserves, and that John Carpenter has been able to witness it. And that it wasn't like a Night of the Hunter situation where like it's after the director dies that suddenly everybody realizes like they're genius. But yeah, this movie has everything. It's like isolation. It's got psychological horror. It's a creature feature. Like kind of like almost every like subgenre of horror just about like fits into The Thing almost. It really is everything. And it's what many people, including I think both of us, agree is like the best horror movie of all time. And
Yeah,
it's all you need.
I think subjectively it's pretty much there.
Yeah, and that's all I got to say about it.
Yeah, and next up, Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. Very influential. I think this is maybe one that's a bit more of like pop culture influential as opposed to influencing how horror developed going forward.
Definitely.
But still incredibly prevalent in pop culture despite there not being a movie in like 20 years. One of the most famous movie killers of all time, with not Voorhees. Freddy. Yep. I was like Freddy Voorhees. I'm shipping him. New ship. It's not Freddy v Jason anymore. It's Freddy X Jason. Yeah, with Freddy Krueger. There's not much to say because like even if you don't watch horror movies, you know about Nightmare on Elm Street and you know about Freddy Krueger. Everyone's seen Knife Glove. Like, I don't know. There's not much to say.
Yeah, and of course, it's also launched the career of Johnny Depp. There's a fun fact about it. The practical effects, in particular, are amazing, and yeah, it's one where if you're talking essentials, you got to have Freddy Krueger in there. Like, you can't not have one of like the three biggest slasher villains of all time. So, yeah, and then of course, the movie that probably, well, I don't know, Wes Craven's known for a lot. There's another one on here that we haven't got to yet. I was going to say it's probably like his biggest movie, but
I don't think it is.
Debate that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's The Fly, 1986, which
gotta have some Cronenberg.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking of. I was moving on already. Yeah, Wes Craven did Nightmare on Elm Street. He did. I mean, okay. I think there's at least one other Wes Craven movie that should be on this list. I think. Oh no, I might be mixing up directors again. I'm definitely mixing up directors again. Never mind. I mean, you could probably make an argument for a couple other Wes Craven movies, but I don't think, oh man, is Nightmare on Elm Street more influential than the one that's like two over from it?
I would say no.
That's
We'll get to it.
yeah, I don't think it is either, but we will get to it. But yeah, next up is Cronenberg's The Fly.
Yeah,
Really,
you just
this
gotta have
is
some Cronenberg representation in
Yeah.
there, and also again because this is the body horror
Exactly.
representation.
yeah, pretty much exactly that. This is why, like, this created body horror as a subgenre essentially, and also Jeff Goldblum, hell yeah.
Yeah, even though of course the Thing is also body horror, but like The Fly is what everybody thinks to and thinks of as the body horror movie.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then next up from that, we have The Silence of the Lambs from 1991. Yeah, this movie just bangs. This is a great movie, iconic. One of the greatest performances from a horror villain of all time, with Anthony Hopkins. This is one that's also just in the public consciousness, like heavily.
For sure. Yeah, it's extremely well known and recognizable. For example, just like the Hannibal Lecter mask, like a lot of like kind of quotable lines and everything. And also because the only horror movie to ever win Best Picture, like we talked about in our Oscars episode. It swept, I'm pretty sure, at the Oscars. And that, I think, on its own, the fact that it's the only movie in the entire like horror zeitgeist to do that warrants a spot on the list.
Absolutely. And after that, we have the movie that I think is Wes Craven's most influential horror movie, which is Scream. And Scream revitalized horror in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think really just deserves a lot of credit. Everyone's heard of Scream. They're still making them. Really an excellent movie, that first one. Like, top tier. Yeah, I don't just definitely deserving of being on this list.
For sure. It holds up, and Scream is also one where you could debate, like, maybe even number one when it comes to influence and the importance. So horror really, like, took a downturn going into the 90s. People generally were getting very tired of the tropes and the cliches and kind of like the hacked out dribble that was coming out. I mean, there were still good horror movies in the late 80s, early 90s. You got Child's Play, you got Candyman, you got, Bram Stoker's Dracula, New Nightmare, Silence of the Lambs, even though, again, most people think of that just more as like a kind of crime thriller than a horror. But either way, horror movies, like in the public eye, really got stale. Slashers especially, because of just how overdone they were. And Scream not only brought horror back in a big way, but it specifically brought the slasher back in a big way. And it also just made horror cool, which is a thing that no movie had ever really done before. Before that, typically as an actor, like you did horror early in your career and like you almost treated it like doing pornography where you didn't really want to talk about it. Like again, people like Johnny Depp, DiCaprio, Jennifer Aniston, George Clooney, Jamie Lee Curtis, so many actors got into their career doing horror, and it was a thing you didn't really want to stick around in. And Scream really changed that. You had big name actors in there. Even like after Scream with Halloween H2O, Jamie Lee Curtis even came back to the franchise. Like it made horror cool. It brought it into like that kind of like hip MTV age, and it was so big that basically horror like entirely for the next like 5 or 6 or 7 years was pretty much just other people trying to knock off Scream. You had like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Valentine, all these movies that were really trying to capture the same kind of essence. And yeah, it's why in terms of like importance, Scream is like really, really close to number one.
Yeah, no, for sure. And after Scream, we have the Japanese horror classic Ring or Ringu from 1998. And I think this one just kind of brought in J-horror and Asian horror as kind of subgenres. I do think J-horror and K-horror, which is kind of newer, are very different. but really expanding horror into Eastern audiences and expanding Eastern media into like outwards to Western audiences. Ring was super influential.
Yes, it needs to be mentioned because specifically around this time, Japanese horror was just like the shit. There were so many big releases in like a 6 or 7 year span in the late 90s going into the early to mid 2000s. You had like Cure, Pulse, Ring, The Grudge, Audition, Dark Water, One Missed Call. Yeah, you just had so many. And so Ring was the big one that, of course, produced the remake of The Ring, which you could argue that can be on here as well. I'm considering that one as well. But either way, like that period of J horror before it really fell off needs representation, and also because of the impact and the influence that it did have on Western horror as well.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with all of that, and we'll move, I think, from there right on to the next one, which we've already talked about. So I like we don't need to relitigate the importance of this movie, but it is the Blair Witch Project from 1999, which we've talked about it. Giga banger.
Yep. Go watch that episode. We're not gonna dive into it again here.
Yeah.
We have a few more of these left. We have like 6 left. And you want to introduce the next one?
Six more, and then I have a couple that I think should be on here as well. But we'll see how much time we have for those. But next we do have 28 Days Later, 2002. I think this should be. I think I'll say it. I think Shaun of the Dead should also be on this list for the exact same reason of 28 Days Later. I think those two movies together really revitalized the zombie subgenre of horror. And I don't think there's really many people who would argue that it's any other movies but those two.
Yeah, I mean, Sean's a different conversation. I'll stick with 28 for now. So 28 Days Later, in a way, was like Scream for the zombie subgenre. Like, I struggle to think of, like, really any, like, zombie movies from the 90s outside of maybe Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead. Like, they really fell off, especially. And 28 Days Later brought it into the modern age, like Scream did with the slasher. And it also introduced, of course, the running zombie. It tackled like the themes of humanism extremely well, like I've talked about. In my opinion, still better than any other zombie movie to this day. And again, also just very iconic. Like anybody will recognize the shots of Cillian Murphy, just walking around deserted London. It's
killing zombies with his jawbones. And his cheeks and his cheekbones. Just full facial structure, just cutting zombies in half. Speaking of cutting people in half, next movie is Saw from 2004? Yeah, 2004.
Yeah, 04.
Really, I mean, invented torture porn as a subgenre. Incredibly well known, definitely still in the public consciousness. I think helped make horror movies an event again in theaters. Just really, I think, important as far as like 2000s movies go.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned that Saw on its own is not a torture porn movie. The sequels, of course, all are, starting with number 2. But the first one's more just a crime thriller, horror, murder mystery, whodunit kind of thing. Yeah. And it's still great, holds up really well.
There's a little bit of the torturiness in it, but it mainly inspired them going forward more than it was one on its own.
Yeah, and I do want to briefly say, when it comes to this, horror often mimics the state of the world that we're in. So like 70s, like you get Vietnam, horror movies become extremely more violent and more disturbing. And then a similar thing with the 2000s, you have like war in the Middle East, you have 9/11, just more like terror attacks. And then you get, 28, you get Saw, you get Hostel, torture porn becomes more of a thing. And so again, that's like, you're getting way more into like a academic field when you start diving into that. But I just wanted to bring that up here and mention that stark contrast. I considered putting Hostel on here. I just couldn't really justify it entirely. But I think Saw alone represents it well enough for that era.
Yeah, I agree. And most people, and Saw is also just much more popular than Hostel even for people who
Definitely.
aren't horror fans. And speaking of movies that are popular for people who aren't generally horror fans, next up is Paranormal Activity, which I think you've put on here. Similar to Blair Witch Project, it really created the boom of found footage movies. So Blair Witch is the Black Christmas to Halloween's to Paranormal Activity's Halloween in terms of making found footage movies happen. Blair Witch is much better than Paranormal Activity. But also, Paranormal Activity is an incredibly popular movie and film series in the public consciousness. And I think a lot of the more recent ones are going to basically be that. There's one coming up next that isn't at all. But yeah, Paranormal Activity, just super popular.
Yeah, I was going to say that Paranormal Activity was like the Friday to Blair Witch Project's Halloween. But like same principle, same concept, you know? But yeah, Paranormal started the boom. We talked about that as well in the Blair Witch episode. I'm not going to dive into it more. It deserves to be on here. And we have 3 more.
Yes, and the next one, I'm not going to have you justify it. I'm just going to say that I disagree. And the next one is Martyrs from 2008. It's a French extreme horror movie. I am imagining it's on there because for people who are fans of horror movies, a lot of people bring this movie up all the time, and it is representative of the kind of French extremist subgenre that does exist in horror. I will say I don't think this movie needs to be on the list. I don't think you're not a horror fan if you haven't seen Martyrs. It's a movie I would not recommend to anyone.
Yeah, it's I would. Again, I guess I kind of am recommending it because I have it on the list.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
like in terms of content and everything, like yeah, I agree. It's not one I would be like, oh, you should go check out Martyrs. Like I myself, I'm not even a fan of the movie. Like I really don't like it myself. But yeah, I wanted representation for French extremity. That is a kind of subgenre that has been getting bigger. Yeah. It was a late inclusion. I, for the most part, for a long time, did not have Martyrs on here, but I wanted to include it because it's probably the best one. Technically, you have other probably, memorable ones like Inside. You have like High Tension.
High Tension.
You have Them. Well, either way, like you have a lot of ones that are very well known, but Martyrs is the one that I think is probably the best. Technically, it's the one that most people tend to like, and it's the most popular, and so it was the go-to.
I do think the 2 most popular Letterboxd reviews really kind of sum it up. The first one says it's so good, but I would never ever recommend people watch it. Stay away from this movie at all costs. Agreed. And the second one says it's like that SpongeBob episode in which Squidward drops a sofa on his foot and excruciatingly pulls his toenail off, except it's 99 minutes long. That's a perfect representation of this movie. Yeah, Martyrs is a lot. And I will say there's almost a 10-year gap between Martyrs and the next movie on this list, which I think there could be one right in the middle there. But the next movie is Train to Busan, which again I think is just kind of K-horror being kind of introduced to Western audiences, and also kind of a fresh-ish take on zombies. I don't know if there's any. I guess it was pretty popular. That might be the other reason that it's on here.
Yeah, I mean, Train to Busan basically became more popular than God, and yeah, like you mentioned, it was K-horror representation because, of course, getting into the 2010s, especially the mid to late 2010s, you know, Korean media became extremely popular, and we're still in that era. We haven't really left it. You know, Korean dramas and different series are still very, very popular and get like a lot of inclusion on Netflix, and you have a lot of movies like The Wailing and Train to Busan that are more new-ish and are still very popular. And it also made people go back and look at older Korean horror movies like, you know, The Host and A Tale of Two Sisters and Old Boy and things like that. And so it's one where, again, you could include like almost any. Like there are a lot of options. I just went with Train to Busan because it's probably the most popular and the most recognizable and well-known.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I would agree with that. I have one other one I would recommend that's also added. But for now, we'll move on to the last one on this list, which I think is, of all the modern horror movies, this is the one where I just go like, yeah, and then move on, which is Get Out from 2017, which, yeah.
Yeah, so Get Out, the reason for this was that, getting into the 2010s, horror entered a much less violent, more art house kind of era, one that I'm not shy of saying that I think is the best
Hmm.
era that's ever existed. I think 2010s horror was so fucking good, especially again like 2014 to 2019 in that vicinity. I
Yeah.
think we've kind of left that era. I mean, you're still going to get like good artistic horror movies. Like it's still going to happen, but with them kind of ruling the landscape like they did for a while, I think we're out of that era. And so I think Get Out is a good encapsulation of it. It's extremely popular. And yeah, Jordan Peele became like the go-to kind of example for art house horror after this came out. And when it came to um, social themes and you know things that are either allegorical or just tackling different taboo topics and again social themes, Get Out's a pretty good example. I think there are ones that I definitely like a lot more, but it's the one that, like I said, is very popular, really recognizable, and really stands out. But I didn't add any newer ones because I think we just have to kind of wait and see which movies post Get Out
Yeah.
are going to like get that kind of reputation. So I think that's a good point right now to leave off. I don't know which ones after. Maybe Hereditary you could make an argument for,
I have
but
two that have come out after Get Out that I have put on here, but I think should tentatively be on this list. But
I'd be
I'm just
curious
gonna
to
run
guess them. Can you give me the
through.
year?
2023 for one of them, and then you've already said Hereditary.
Okay, that's cool. I'm glad. Really, one from just last year that you want to
I think in
include on there.
terms of the horror community and its reaction to this movie, I think it will actually have some effect on horror going forward. I'll tell
Oh
you, we
no,
watched it together. I don't think either of us thought it was as good as the community's reaction to it.
not Infinity Pool. Evil
No.
Dead Rise.
3 words? Maybe it was 2024. I thought it was 2023.
It's not When Evil Lurks.
It is When Evil Lurks.
Huh. I'm
I
curious to hear your justification for that.
I think the horror community has reacted to that movie in such a profound way, deservedly or undeservedly. I think that movie is going to have a lot of people's individual opinions weigh in on whether or not the attention it's getting is deserved. But I think the reaction to it is so extreme on the kind of horror movie spectrum that I think it will influence people's, like, the limits they're willing to push in horror movies going forward for a bit. I think people are gonna take it as an example and follow it. I was so tempted to say Skinamarink just to piss people off, um, but I don't think
Could. I
Skinamarink.
mean, that's
I
kind of like its own type
Yeah,
of subgenre, like the lo-fi kind of
I think
analog horror.
in
That's only getting
yeah.
bigger too. You actually could make an
Yeah,
argument for Skinamarink.
actually, maybe I'll make an argument for Skinamarink. But those Hereditary
Yeah,
and,
talk you
and
into
When
it.
Evil Lurks were my two that are post to Get Out. I think Hereditary should be on this list, 100%. But going back up to the top of my list, I wrote Where's Wicker Man? That movie should be on this
I mean,
list.
you know me. I love the Wicker Man.
Yeah.
Again, Wicker Man is a top five, but it's like it's one where, like, how did it change things? You know what I mean? Like, it didn't have copycats. Like, it's not
Yeah.
super prominent
Yeah,
in
okay, that's fair, actually.
culture. It's
Um,
yeah, it's a little more. It's a little more in that territory of like, if you're not a big horror fan, you probably don't know about the Wicker Man or care about
yeah,
it.
that's fair. I did put Where's Gojira? That should be on this list.
Oh,
There's no excuse for Godzilla not being the original Godzilla not being on this list.
no, I completely agree with you. I'm gonna like make that change right now.
There
I'm
you
glad
go.
you said that.
I did say that I think in the kind of run of the Exorcist, Amityville horror kind of movies, either The Omen or Rosemary's Baby should probably be on this list. I lean towards The Omen personally, but I think Rosemary's Baby probably did more to influence the horror genre. And then I also put The Conjuring along the same lines, could probably be on this list.
I can definitely see both of those. I think at one point I maybe did have Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah.
Took it off for some reason. I think it was because even
Maybe
though it's obviously
religious
very
horror stopped
good and it is like a memorable movie, I just couldn't fully put it into the boxes of like, okay, it didn't necessarily change the game in a way. Like, again,
it kind of
it's
revolutionized
its own
religious
standalone.
horror.
I mean, how so? Like,
It
like
came
how
out
would you
before
say?
The Exorcist by 5 years.
I think of like other movies that also had like religion play into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I don't know. That one's a bit more of a question mark.
yeah.
The Conjuring I can see though, because like after that and Insidious came out,
One of those
like
two should be on
haunted
the
house,
list,
supernatural. Yeah, because like
New
supernatural,
wave.
like haunted house
Yeah.
movies did. Yeah, exactly. James Wan brought that back in a big way, so I could definitely see. I think I would go with the Conjuring of the two of those. I think it's
I
a
definitely
better
would as well.
movie.
I do. I like Insidious, but I definitely would go with The Conjuring over Insidious. I did put Phantom of the Opera probably deserves a shout. I don't know if it deserves to be on the list, but it does. It's a very influential movie and deserves a shout. I put The Birds ?
I think those are all ones that I've considered, like especially Phantom of the Opera. But it's again one where Phantom surprisingly, like I think it's really only like the final kind of shot
That's
really
horror. Yeah.
for Phantom of the Opera, and it's one where like at least kind of checking like the views, like it's not, it's surprisingly low view. Like not many people
Yeah.
that you would, not as many as you would think have like actually kind of checked that movie out, and it's definitely not one where it feels, even though it came out a few years after Caligari and Nosferatu, it doesn't feel like as polished or just as memorable as a movie.
Yeah, I
it's
will
really
say
one where to
you don't
me-
have to, because I am springing these on you. You don't have to
Yeah,
justify all of these. These are mainly just my thoughts as I've gone through of movies I'd potentially include.
sure. And I thought about The Birds as well. I'm like, I think as we almost started recording, I started thinking about that one again and considering it, because it's one where I think you could make an argument just in terms of like, again, more pop culture,
Yeah,
like lasting significance. You could make an argument for The Birds as well.
yeah. I did put, and I think one of these three movies should be on there, and probably two of them. Cannibal Holocaust should probably be on this list, in the same vein as Martyrs. And one of the first two Evil Dead movies should probably be on this list. Personally, I would lean
I think it's
towards
pretty fair.
Yeah, personally, I'd lean towards Evil Dead 2 over original Evil Dead. But one of the first two Evil Dead movies should be on this list, and Cannibal Holocaust is the perfect representation of like extremist travel exploitation horror that is its own subgenre. People don't really make it much anymore, but like people know about Cannibal
Well, for good
Holocaust.
reason. Dude got freaking arrested because they thought he made a snuff movie.
But like that should probably be on. If Martyrs is going to be on this list, and it's going to be like a thing of like, if you're a horror fan, you probably should watch this. Cannibal Holocaust is as influential as Martyrs, if not more, and should probably be on this list because it also encapsulates its own subgenre. I have put The Sixth Sense, mainly because it's incredibly famous.
Yeah, I think you can make an argument for The Sixth Sense. I think at one point I strongly considered Cannibal Holocaust because it helped to influence like the found footage movies. It was technically the first movie to have that. I think I'm just so like fuck Cannibal Holocaust.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
There. So maybe that's just my own personal
do the Green
bias where I
Inferno or
should be,
whatever
like,
the
more
fuck that one
objective.
is?
That movie sucks. I watched that one.
That movie does suck. Yeah, they all suck.
Yeah, but like Cannibal Holocaust is one where even on like Martyrs, I didn't have this feeling, but I watched Cannibal Holocaust for that same reason of like, oh, it's a landmark title. I got to watch it at some point, and then I watched it, and I'm like, I'd be fine without watching that movie.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that's
No,
kind of how I feel about it.
you don't have to watch Cannibal Holocaust, and you don't have to watch Martyrs, and you're still a true horror fan if you don't watch either. You're a true horror fan if you watch whatever fucking horror movies you want to watch. To be fair,
Yeah, exactly.
You could watch
throw
none
any
of the
title in
movies.
there.
Yeah, you could watch none of the movies on this list, and you could still be a true horror fan. So
Yeah.
there's that. I will say there's a kind of weird niche subgenre, kind of pre-Get Out in the, I think it was pre-Get Out. Oh shit, some of these might not be pre-Get Out. In the 2010s that I called theme horror movies, or like message horror movies. And I said, I put 3 down that could be on the list. I put It Follows, Invisible Man, or The Babadook. Could all encapsulate that kind of weird subgenre movement that was happening in the 2010s.
Yeah. I've thought about those. Fun fact, I actually had The Babadook on here, and I replaced it with Get Out.
I think
Because again, I just wanted one to encapsulate that kind of art house era. I think The Babadook kind of blew the starting whistle on it, but Get Out, I think, is just so much more prominent and impactful that I actually swapped it for Get Out at one point.
I don't think you'd be wrong having both. Obviously, I also think you should have Cabin, mainly because I think that's the best horror spoof that's still a horror movie. I think that and Sean are basically the 2 best horror comedies out there, and one of them should be on the list just for that. And then I put, this is one that I think for K-horror, I think The Host should be on this list, because I think that was kind of the first K-horror that really made its way to America, whereas Train to Busan kind of encapsulates the explosion of K-horror in the late 2010s. The Host was 2006, and it was Bong Joon-ho, and that movie slaps, and it was, in my opinion, it really paved the way for movies like Train to Busan to eventually truly make their way into the US like pop culture hive mind.
I can see it. Yeah, there's an argument for that.
Yeah. And then the last one
I'm glad you're Oh, sorry, give your last one, my bad.
I have one last one which I think encapsulates the kind of break-in horror movies, as well as setting up a lot of not necessarily genre tropes, but ways of filming. And I'll explain it after I tell you what the movie is, because I think it's easier. It's The Strangers.
Yeah, that's what I was figuring when you started giving the explanation.
And I think that that's the movie that I think that, or the first Purge movie, are like the home invasion horror movies, defining that subgenre, to me at least. And I think the way that The Strangers is filmed and produced has influenced a lot of current directors and filmmakers in terms of things like Mike Flanagan always wants things in the background of his shots. Like that's The Strangers. If The Strangers didn't in some way influence that, I'd be shocked. Just for me, that movie definitely had an impact. I just think it was a much more quiet, in like almost an insidious impact on the horror genre, and it also encapsulates like break-in movies for me.
I might, just because looking at this, I don't think I actually even have like a home invasion movie. I mean, you could maybe argue Last House in that way, but it's like not really that kind of movie. So I could maybe throw that one on there. They're good. Like, they're all pretty good recommendations though. Like I, at one point, just stopped showing this to people because I would check, and then just everybody would just want me to put their favorite fucking movie on there, and then would just get like, it was clear that like they didn't either understand like the point of the list, or they just were just mad because I didn't have their favorite movie, and so I just stopped showing it to people after a couple of times.
I mean, obviously you're wrong because Jason X isn't on this list, but I'm willing to look past that.
Actually, sorry, just like Godzilla, I need to go ahead and just type that in right now and include that. But
Godzilla should be on
no,
there.
all very
that
good.
was one where I was
already
like,
changed it.
Yeah, the second time I went through, I looked at the first time and I was like, okay, some controversial ones, and then I went through it again and I was like, wait a minute, where the fuck is Godzilla? What is Joe doing?
Yeah. Yes, I went ahead and already changed it. Both Evil Dead and Godzilla are on there because I do strongly agree with those. And that's like why I said it's always going to be a work in progress.
Always, yeah, it'll
But
always be changing.
so I think we're up to 44 on here now. If you click the link, it will be updated. And I will try at some point to update. I wouldn't mind if you send me those in like a message. Like
Yes,
when
I
you
can
see
do
them,
that.
and weigh those options. But we've been going for a while. It's quite late. And I think we can go ahead and wrap things up if you don't have any kind of like closing remarks on the list or
No.
anything else regarding it.
I think it's a good list. Definitely worth kind of taking a look at these movies. If you want to get into horror movies, I don't know if I'd start with most of these, but if you're into horror movies, absolutely take a look at these. If there are ones you haven't seen, they're probably all worth taking a look. Obviously, again, I trigger warning, I guess, on Martyrs for just the entire movie, and also Evil Dead, I guess, for and Last House for exploitation of women. I think those three deserve a trigger warning.
For sure. But that's going to go ahead and wrap it up with this episode of the Killed Off Screen podcast. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to recommend a movie for us to watch and possibly review here on the podcast, you can send it in an email suggestion to killedoffscreenpod@gmail.com. These episodes come out every 2 weeks, every other Wednesday. The next episode, we are going to be doing a more in-depth review of Late Night with the Devil because I was distracted watching it and Prentice hadn't seen it yet. So I'm going to rewatch it. He's watched it, and so we will be reviewing that for the next one. So if you don't want to be spoiled, give that one a watch. You should anyway because it's a very good movie. But we will see you all in the next one.